In the spring of 1565, the Mediterranean was no longer a highway for trade. It was a vast, blue cemetery. We lived on a rock called Malta, a scrap of limestone in the center of the world that the Ottoman Sultan viewed as a pebble in his shoe. He came from the east with 40,000 soldiers, bringing a theology of absolute conquest to bury our faith in the salt. They didn't know that for a knight of St. John, every wave is a prayer, and the sea is not an obstacle, but an altar prepared for a final sacrifice. We were the last of the warrior and monks, a dying breed of men who had spent centuries losing ground. But here, on this rock, the retreat had to stop. We lived in the shadow of the stone, watching the horizon, waiting for the first white sail to break the line between sky and water. This is the unsealed record of the year the cross refused to sink, a time when the only language spoken was the language of iron. The Ottoman fleet arrived on the 18th of May, a slow-moving forest of wood, silk, and gunpowder. 193 ships carrying the wrath of a sultan who had never known a true defeat. From the ramparts of Birgu, we could hear the rhythmic beat of their drums across the water, a sound that matched the pounding of our own hearts. The theology of war was a math of suicide, 500 knights and a few thousand local militia against the full might of an empire. We watched them disembark, a tide of scarlet and gold spilling onto our white stones. We smelled the sulfur and the dried meat on the wind, knowing that the world we knew was about to be ground into dust. The Sultan didn't just want our land, he wanted to erase our memory, to turn our chapels into stables and our stories into smoke. We sharpened our blades in silence, waiting for the first cannon to speak. Fort St. Elmo was the key to the harbor, and it became our first limb to be cut off. For 28 days, that small star fort was a slaughterhouse of stone and bone. Every hour our walls were being ground into powder by Turkish iron. We were out of hope, sleeping in the mud of the breaches, clutching our swords as the only truth we had left. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite, charged our walls with a religious fury that mirrored our own. They were promised paradise for every knight they killed. We were promised only the dirt. In the heat of July, the smell of rot and black powder became our only atmosphere. We realized then that in this war, the only way to save the soul was to destroy the flesh. We became living ghosts, haunting our own fortifications, waiting for a relief force that was a month too late. When the ammunition ran low and the swords were notched like saws, we turned to the Warhammer. In the narrow, dark tunnels of the fort, a sword was a luxury we couldn't afford. The Warhammer was a theology of impact. We felt the vibration of every blow travel through our arms and into our very souls. It was the only weapon that could punch through the Sultan's heavy plate armor. The sound of a warhammer hitting a breastplate was a dull, wet thud that echoed in the stone chambers, the only music the gods were listening to that summer. We became the anvil, and the Sultan was the hammer, but we refused to crack. Every time they breached the wall, they were met with a line of men holding warhammers, ready to crush the life out of anyone who dared to step on our sacred soil. It wasn't about finesse anymore. It was about the raw, heavy weight of survival. Then came the moment that changed the soul of the Mediterranean. After St. Elmo fell, the Sultan beheaded our brothers and floated their bodies across the bay on crosses, a psychological trap designed to make us beg for mercy. But our Grand Master, de Valette, had a different theology. He didn't weep. He didn't pray for peace. He executed his own prisoners and fired their heads back from our cannons, hacking the Sultan's terror with a message of iron. It was a rain of heads that told the empire one thing: there would be no surrender. We had weaponized our own despair.
The Ottoman generals watched in horror as their own men were fired back at them, and in that moment the momentum of the siege shifted. We showed them that we had no fear left to give, and a man with nothing left to lose is an enemy that cannot be defeated by any earthly power. I sit here now, centuries later, and I can still smell the salt and the old iron. These names, the 500 who held the line, are being washed away by the tides of time and the convenience of modern forgetting. History is a record of the human spirit at its absolute limit, but that record is burning. Theology of War is not just a documentary channel, it is a digital rescue mission. We are excavating these forbidden moments, reconstructing the grain of the film and the texture of the Warhammer before the light goes out forever. Every contribution on Ko-Fi funds the massive rendering power needed for these 35mm excavations. We are the last line of defense for a history that is being silenced by the noise of the present. Become a guardian of history. Join our mission. Save the sacred before the sea claims it forever. In September, the horizon changed. The Gran Soccorso, the relief force, finally arrived. Against logic, against the math of empires, the cross had held. The Sultan's fleet retreated into the morning mist, leaving behind a sea of ghosts and a fortress that was now more blood than stone. The Siege of Malta proved that an empire can take a city, but it cannot conquer a faith that has already accepted its own end. We walked through the ruins of Birgu, looking at the dented armor and the broken warhammers, and we realized that we had survived the apocalypse. The theology of salt and iron remained written in the rubble, a debt that the Mediterranean still remembers every time the tide comes in. We didn't win a battle. We won a century of silence for the West, paid for by the lives of men who refused to blink. The walls are rebuilt now, and the tourists walk where the blood once ran like rivers. But if you stand in the deep chambers of Fort St. Elmo and close your eyes, the echo of the Warhammer still rings in the stone. The past is not dead. It is a ghost waiting for a witness. I have shown you the price of the sea. I have shown you what men are willing to do for a story. Now the burden of that memory belongs to you. Subscribe to unseal the next archive. The theology of war never ends. It only waits for the next candle to flicker out. Are you ready to see the next truth? Because the debt is never fully paid.